Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. I always know when we have a very important event when I see General Scowcroft joining us, so thank you so much, Chairman of our International Advisory Board and really one of the great leaders in the entirety of the Atlantic Council's history, not to mention the United States. So thank you for being with us. We're honored to be joined by Prime Minister Salam Fayyad, Dr. Salam Fayyad, former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority and the Atlantic Council's first distinguished statesman, resident at the Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. Prime Minister Fayyad's voice has been one of steadfast wisdom in the discourse on the future of Middle East peace and security and what that means for the world at large. So Dr. Fayyad, thank you for being with us. It's no secret to anyone in this room that the Middle East confronts monumental challenges to achieving any sort of chance at stability and security. Just 1 week ago, the world was horrified to witness the gruesome death of a Jordanian pilot by militants. In response, the coalition ramped up their offensive against the group, and now ISIS claims that the last known American hostage was killed in a retaliatory airstrike. I also, this is not directly pertinent to this conversation geographically, you wouldn't think, but I also had a very interesting conversation at the Munich Security Conference with President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan, where he's talking about new networks coming into Afghanistan, including Daesh, where he's going to be facing this as well, and he's talking about the ecology of terror, the network of terror, and thinking that we have to think of brand new ways to go after something that may seem like it's a regional phenomena, but goes way beyond that. In a recent interview, General John Allen, Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIS, highlighted the strategic challenges in defeating ISIS. Quote, ISIS is better organized than Al-Qaeda. Its command and control is better. ISIS' situational awareness of a broader battle space across the entire region is much better. And so, of course, we have adapted to that as well. From rising sectarianism, poor governance, widespread youth unemployment, conflicts and instabilities in the Middle East today have a lot of roots and have a lot of various causes. The answer of how to take this on is evasive, but we know this much. We need dynamic, innovative, and new thinking, longer-term strategic thinking on how the region's major stakeholders, including the West, can address these issues and work toward a peaceful and prosperous Middle East. The Atlantic Council considers this an issue of utmost importance, and we've done some substantial work already on the strategic challenges confronting the region, but we're going to double down on that work now, both in the Hariri Center and the Scowcroft Center as they're ramping up strategic projects in the Hariri Center, co-chaired by one of our panelists today, Steve Hadley, with Madeleine Albright, and led by Frank Ricciardone, another one of our panelists today, and the Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Director now of the Hariri Center. Our speakers will address these major strategic issues, assessing the opportunities and challenges 2015 and beyond. And as I said, joining Dr. Fayyad is going to be the Council Board Director, Steve Hadley, former National Security Advisor, our own Ambassador, Frank Ricciardone, Vice President, Director of our Hariri Center. Aside from his Middle East posts, Afghanistan, Egypt, Jordan, he also has served in Turkey, and it's very unusual for an envoy of his experience and to have been in those kinds of posts, Turkey and the Middle East, and for that matter also in Asia and the Philippines. Our moderator is Jay Solomon, Foreign Affairs Correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, my alma mater. I've respected Jay's work for many years, and I can't think of anyone better to lead this discussion. One housekeeping note, we encourage you to follow the conversation on Twitter. Please tweet, and I'm not against other forms of social networking, but this is the only one where I have to tell you about a hashtag. And so please tweet at the Atlantic Council with the hashtag AC Mideast. So, gentlemen, look forward to your discussion, and the platform is yours.
We're on? We're on. Welcome, everybody. Great to be here, gentlemen. I just wanted to start first on looking at the current crisis in the region, whether it's ISIS's rise in Iraq and Syria, Iraq's civil war, the Yemeni civil war and the takeover by the Houthi militia, the civil war in Libya. Why is this concurrently seem to all be happening now? We're 5 years past the kind of the beginning of the Arab Spring, so some of this stuff seemed to have settled a little bit, but maybe not for very long. There's obviously been a lot of criticism of U.S. foreign policy in the last 4 or 5 years, obviously longer than that, but particularly disengaging too quickly and sort of by disengaging, allowing vacuums for militias, bad actors, bad states to sort of fill the void. So maybe I can start with Prime Minister Fayyad. When you look at this period in history, why is so much happening so wrong at the same time?
Thank you. I honestly do not know if there is one answer to this question, or if all of these developments can be explained by appealing to one factor that's causing all of this turmoil to be happening in various parts of the region. That's the Middle East today. But I think a common thread that could possibly explain why it is that when things started to unravel in one part of the region, then started to unravel elsewhere, is the fact that the region has had for a long time a tradition of strong men and weak states and state structures. That does not explain why this kind of turmoil is happening. There are other reasons for this, and I can't speak to those, as a matter of fact. But key amongst which, in my view, is nearly 6 decades, if not even more, of this situation where you have countries with weak state structures, strong men, yes, encouraged and accepted and promoted by the global West, if I may call it that, for expediency. Finding it easier to deal with regimes that are constituted this way, conspiring all along to produce a great depth of resentment that was bottled up for a long period of time. And then when things started to happen in Tunisia, it was like a domino effect. But that, I think, is the common thread. You have poor governance, a lot of disenfranchisement, not only economically, but importantly, politically speaking. A lot of people feeling not included in the system. With poor governance happening, particularly over the past 30 years, coinciding with progressive opening up of the world, the globalization, change technology, vast changes in technology and improvements to where citizens of the region started to know on an ongoing basis what it means to really be a respected citizen elsewhere in the world. And that really actually sparked what then subsequently became a pan-regional, if you will, phenomenon that can be best characterized as one of upheaval and turmoil. I'm afraid a state that's likely to be with us for a much longer period of time than many of us would be comfortable to admit.
Mr. Hadley?
I agree with that. I think that's right. A couple sort of embroidering on that point. I think the governments in the region generally did not meet the expectations of their people, and as the region opened up through media and the like to understand how life was outside the region, those expectations went up, and the performance of the governments in terms of providing services and hope and a better life and jobs and all the rest did not go up. And of course, the demographic bulge, the large number of young people, put even more pressure on the system. I think the second thing is, we've been talking a lot about this. There's an underlying, crisis of legitimacy. In other words, you had a lot of authoritarians that didn't have a lot of authority. And there is a question, I think, in some sense, a crisis of legitimacy that the national governments face of how they can, what are the foundations of regimes that will have the support of their people going forward. Because if you think about the appeal of ISIS, ISIS is really saying, you know, a lot of people in the Middle East have a religious identity and a national identity, and ISIS in some sense is saying the religious identity trumps the national identity. And they have a theory of this so-called caliphate, which is a religion-based state that sweeps away national borders. And they're basically saying that is the future of the Middle East, that is the real legitimacy. And if governments are going to stand up against that, they are going to have their own theory of legitimacy, they're going to have authority among their people, and they're going to have to show the level of governance in terms of meeting people's hopes and expectations that they haven't been able to do for the last 6 decades.
Ambassador?
Precisely bring both of these together. When I had the privilege of serving as ambassador in the Bush administration, we worked hard in the region to try to address what we saw as the fundamental problem of a democracy deficit, a deficit of governance, as Dr. Fayyad, as Prime Minister Fayyad has pointed out. But we've come to realize, and maybe this is a service Daesh, ISIS has almost provided, with blinding clarity to us in the West, and I think to the stakeholders in the region, that the problem is actually a profound challenge to attack on the very legitimacy of the state order, the order of regional states. They are not challenging regimes that have governed badly for their governance. They are not challenging insufficient provision of services even in some places. They are challenging the source of legitimacy of those who say, we are the state, we set the rules, we enforce them, we govern, we provide and guide economic activity, etc. We come at this with a Western perspective that the voice of the people is the voice of God, vox populi, vox Dei. That's the source of legitimacy of government in the West, of states, not just administration of states. But we have in ISIS someone saying there is no vox populi, it is vox Dei, it is the voice of God. Religion is the source, exclusive source, and of course we interpret the voice of God here. And that seems to be what is shaking the region. We've seen 3 states fall apart, at least, another one under serious challenge, and all of them under at least stated challenge by ISIS. So it's a special treat to have Dr. Fayyad here. You are one who worked to establish a state, actually, and earned the recognition of legitimacy at 2 levels. One, from a majority of your own people, but then also from many, many other states around the world. The United States worked with you, and indeed to try to get the standing of the Palestinian Authority as not only an administration, but of a state. And you did that in the midst of conflict. You did it as an economist facing huge structural economic problems, trying to set up a state order, rule of law that would permit trade and investment and economic growth. That you achieved the degree of success you did was pretty amazing. But regardless of the degree of success or failure, I think there's no one better equipped from the region to inform the rest of us as how do the stakeholders in a state order there that is falling apart in at least 3 places, how do they regenerate an order of states that will permit economic activity and a dignified human life? Where are the other Salam Fayyads? Who are they? Where do you start, and how can we out here in the West join in helping you, or at least do no harm?
Look, I think it's really important to get that conversation going again. I say to get that conversation again because for the past few years, up until we got to the point where the West started to feel, well, things are really getting out of hand here, with many acknowledging, not comfortably, but acknowledging that this is really a long-term challenge, that they started raising these questions. Again, when the current policy on confronting ISIS was promulgated in September of this year by President Obama, last year by President Obama, some, myself included, said this is all focusing, maybe excessively, and it's preoccupied with the military dimension when in fact there are these other issues that really need to be dealt with in order to have a fully integrated approach to dealing with this multi-layered, multifaceted phenomenon that's ISIS and the like, so to speak. At the core of the strategy should be, these questions of how do societies move on with constituting themselves properly to govern themselves in a manner that in this day and age has to be responsive to the needs of the people who are governed. How the relationship between those who are in government and the citizens ought to be framed and defined. Surely there are the norms of the West that many aspire to really emulate, and where the West at times looks at the region, failed states elsewhere in the world as well, and sometimes simplistically think that they are the way they are because they failed at emulating us, ignoring in some fashion to really fully understand the overall context. Religion was mentioned as a factor, an antidote, so to speak, to the lack of legitimacy. I think it was exploited. That's an insight I would like to contribute with humbly, if I may. It was not the driver. If I can think of ISIS as, if one can think of ISIS or ISIL or groups like ISIL, insurgencies like ISIL, as a multi-layered phenomena, the outermost layer is religion, not the innermost one. It's almost like an afterthought. You have rebellion, essentially, against status quo, with forces joined by factions from way out right to way out left, Muslim Brotherhood one end of the spectrum to communists and former communists on the other end of the spectrum, all joined in the rejection of status quo. One characterized by a great deal of injustice, sense of deep injustice, deep sense of injustice, product of many years of this region being governed again by governance frameworks and systems characterized by strong men, weak states, and state structures. That equation has to change, I think, and that conversation, should get going. And that really could begin to deal with this threat as a long-term threat, one that's really going to be with us, and source of danger, instability, for a very long period of time. Very, very long period of time.
When you take a step back,
Yeah.
I mean, how much of this is historical in the sense that I know there is the sense that the borders of the Middle East aren't going to survive where they are. And when you look kind of broader in the world right now, you see the borders of Europe being tested. You see the Chinese kind of testing the structure in Asia. It feels like there's a broader kind of theme going on in the world. But do you think the Middle East current borders will survive?
One would think that there comes a point in time when you move on, so to speak. Why is it that borders are where they are? There is this thing in the Arab world that the Levant in particular, that part of the Middle East was somehow partitioned in a capricious way by the British and the French back in 1916 in ways that should not be there, that we are one nation. And there is, that thinking. And that, as a matter of fact, drove the movement that's, and the ideology that's Arab nationalism and pan-Arab nationalism, if you will, for decades, actually, 50s, 60s, and part of 70s, as a matter of fact. I think until the end of the 60s, decade of 60s, that somehow those borders were forced upon us. And there is a point to be made, I think, in terms of those borders having been arbitrarily drawn by the French and the British at the time, and the region sort of broken up into the countries it ended up being broken into. Something that people did not like very much, but you would think from 1916 to 2015, about a century later, that we should be prepared to move on. Why are boundaries between the states of the United States where they are? It's not really a subject matter of great deal of discussion anymore. There comes a point in time when you move on. I think what really complicated the narrative in the Middle East is that you have a succession of events that contributed to this sense of injustice, deep sense of injustice in the region, including the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian cause, including the fact that it has gone on for a very long period of time. And especially as people started to think that, well, the whole world is really dealing by way of double standards when it comes to the Palestinians, for example, and dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And this argument became very, very strong, as a matter of fact, around the time of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, when the United States stood forcefully against that invasion. And former President George Bush at the time said, a line in the sand has been drawn, and this is not to be crossed. This occupation must end. The region, the echo of that very powerful message in the region was something different. Double standards, I was saying. How come the occupation of Iraq, of Kuwait, of Kuwait, cannot be allowed to stand, but then there was this occupation going on since 1967. It was going on. It fed into this sense of injustice again, and that's still with us. And then people looked, technology started to change, a lot of media proliferation and all of that. And as I said, people's consciousness, degree of awareness of what was going on elsewhere in the world, what it meant to be a respected citizen in the United States, in Western Europe, elsewhere in the world, became very clear to citizens in ways that the regimes and government in power in our countries did not understand, could not relate to.
And if you pick up on that, I think it answers your question. The disruptions that began in 2011 weren't about borders. And I don't see that adjustments of the borders are going to address the underlying grievances that Salam Fayyad talked about. Indeed, I don't know how you draw borders in the Middle East that would be stable, given the religious and ethnic and tribal divisions. I think the focus of stability needs to address the underlying causes of the disruption and began in 2013. So I think it's less about borders, though people may try to redraw borders, and it's more about the quality of governance and the legitimacy of the governments inside those borders, and whether they can adopt approaches that will include all elements of the society in a way that is inclusive, that is viewed as legitimate, and provides a prospect for the various groups to work together for a common future. That's the question. That's what Iraq has been trying to do since 2003. It seems to me the answer lies less in the borders and more the quality of governance inside those borders.
But do you see any greater commonality when you look at Russia testing Ukraine and Eastern Europe? You see the Chinese testing the South China Sea. You see the borders of the Middle East. I mean, some people will say it's technology, it's demographic, it's a U.S. retrenchment has sort of opened up the way for various actors, whether it's Islamist militias or Vladimir Putin or the Chinese military, to test what has been kind of the post-Cold War era. Do you think that there is a common theme?
I don't. I think the Middle East is different from both Asia and Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Crimea is an issue about whether it ever should have been Ukrainian. I mean, the seeds of that were allocations of territory at a time of the Soviet Union when borders didn't matter. Soviet Union breaks up and suddenly the borders matter. I think what Putin is about is less about borders than more challenging the consensus that emerged after the Cold War, which Russia subscribed to, which was to accept borders, to accept the principle of non-interference, of non-use of force, all the rest. He has a different vision for how he would like to take Europe. He has a vision about Russia's role in Europe and about a Eurasian Europe for which Ukraine is essential. And that's why the struggle is over Ukraine. Is it going to go west or is it going to go east? So I think the issue in each case, you can say, well, it's about borders because borders get crossed. Or in case of Iraq and Syria, they're getting obliterated by ISIS. But I don't think that the underlying problem is the borders. There are other dynamics that are going on in all three areas, even though the underlying dynamics are different in all three areas, I would argue.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think so. The dynamics are different but at least in one sense, there is commonality, and that is the context in which all of these things are happening. Context dominated by, in the main, change in the world order that is yet to be recognized in changed way of managing world affairs. In other words, the world order has changed, but the architecture of managing that world order is yet to take shape. That's a factor in common, and the role of the United States in that system. And why is it that Ukraine happened when it did? How come in many parts of our region, for example, statements by or positions taken by powers to be, not only the United States, but other powers to be in the world, are looked at not to the same degree of seriousness with which they once were taken. There is a lot that has changed during this period. I think the world is grappling, looking for a way in which to make sense out of the changes that have taken place. And I do believe that the architecture of world order, of managing world order, diplomacy, if you will, has to change to reflect new realities. World has changed. You take, for example, what happened in India, China, Brazil, other such countries, accounting for, together, nearly 20% of world output. Where are they in terms of decision making at the global level and all? The decade of the 90s, and particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall back in '89, as a matter of fact, ushered a change in world order. It was recognized, for sure, that it was a change order. It was then President Bush who said that, new world order, and for much of the 90s, it was a unipolar system. World order changed again after September 11. It was not a change that was documented to the same extent or paid attention to the same extent. And I think there's a great deal of ambiguity, lack of clarity in terms of who's responsible for whom, for what are the rules of intervention. Look at what happened in Syria, for example. The failure to take a resolution, pass a decision, Security Council, when it should have, years back, that could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, not to mention displaced and refugees and all. And the world failed, Security Council failed time and again to really take a decision like that. Maybe we would not have been looking at what is now an ISIL problem to the fullest extent it is today, and to the extent that it is likely to continue to evolve into one that is characterized by diabolical methods, gruesome killings, and what have you, and something the end of which is really not around the corner, I don't think. I'm afraid it isn't.
I mean, when we look at the Obama administration approach, Ambassador, maybe you can start. We know kind of the history of the last couple of years. There was criticism that Obama disengaged too quickly from Iraq. There was criticism that he drew red lines in Syria and then never backed them up. He said he was going to support the Syrian opposition and kind of never really aggressively did. Looking forward with this new AUMB that's come out in the past few days, and sort of, it seems with ISIS's rise, there is more focus on arresting this spread of the militancy. Do you think the U.S. policy is becoming more clear-cut? Is it going to be effective, or is it still looks like Obama's just trying to sort of pass this down? He's not going to go into Syria with troops aggressively, and he's not going to put boots on the ground. It's not going to really deal with the issue. Do you think policy is getting clearer, or does it still seem pretty muddled?
I think we're all grappling, the United States, this administration, predecessor administrations, but especially now, but also our allies and friends in the region are grappling to find a theory of the case. And that's a part of what this discussion's all about. Our theory earlier had been governance, failure of democracy, democracy deficit. Others had posited, well, economic underdevelopment. And none of these theories really seem to account for the deepening catastrophe, the massive human suffering. Let's not forget that it's as much about that, the suffering going on in the region on a scale not seen on the planet since World War II, the dislocation of people from their homes, the murder, the year after year going by with young men and girls not getting education. The building systemic problem is is not on any path toward resolution that we can see. And we're all struggling to come to terms. So we use words like strategy and lack of a strategy. But if you don't have insight, if none of us, if we don't in the West, with the people in the Middle East, have a common understanding of what the problem is all about, then we go off on tangents saying, well, it's about defeating ISIS. That's an important thing to do. It's a real problem. The question you raised earlier, though, is maybe illuminating. How does this compare to Russia and Ukraine or China and the South China Sea? Those are questions of classical hegemony, great powers imposing their will on another one. What we're seeing in this region is this crisis of legitimacy. It's an indigenous problem. And if we address it as a problem of terrorism, what that means is we in the West will work to protect ourselves from this horror that is going on. We'll do it better or worse, but it won't really address the horrible festering problem that will lead to greater and greater mass suffering. So I think what we started out with here, this question of the legitimacy of the order, a legitimacy of states which enable rule of law, order, healthy societies that can have economic activity, that's what we're grappling with. And if people inside the region still see it in terms of the Great War and Sykes-Picot and people on the outside drawing borders, the United States wanting our oil, that's not going to lead, I think, to a theory of the case that will hold up in speaking with us. And if we approach it as, you have a terrible problem of violent extremism, you have to do this about it, and if you don't, whether you do or you don't, we're going to protect ourselves, it's still not going to resolve it. We'll protect ourselves, but it's not going to get better.
And there are really two things we need. One is we need a theory of the case. And then secondly, we, speaking of the United States, have to decide whether we care about, whether we think it matters for us. And there's been a narrative out there because of the difficulties post-Afghanistan and Iraq. I heard someone say, well, the one thing we've learned from the first decade of the 20th century is us engagement with societies post-conflict to try to help them rebuild themselves is a mistake. We don't do it well, it costs too much, it's a failure. So we're not going to do that again. If we use military force, we're going to get in, we're going to get out. Well, that's not going to help the situation in the Middle East. So we have to understand and make a decision whether we think what happens in the Middle East affects us enough to try to figure out a theory of the case and to figure out a plan of how we can help the people in the Middle East find a more stable future. I think it does matter to us. I think if we don't do that, if we roll back ISIS, help the Iraqi people kick ISIS out of Iraq, and somehow get them out of Syria, and don't then ask the question, what comes next? We will have the same and don't address these problems, they will fester. And we will, in 4 or 5 years, have ISIS 2, which we now know will be more brutal than ISIS 1. And they will, in the end of the day, come for us. So I think there's two things. We have to have a theory of the case. We have to decide that it matters for us and that we're going to have to help the people in the region try to find a way forward. And then we're going to have to make a commitment to do that, recognizing it's going to be the work of decades, if not a generation.
And for that, I think you need a strategy. I mean, I think really beginning to look at the issue in this way requires a strategy, well thought out strategy, one that spans many, many years, if not decades. I mean, this requires serious work. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why this is proving to be too difficult to deal with is while politicians seem to be accepting, I would say rhetorically, the notion that this is long-term source of threat and stability and danger and all of that sort of thing, I do not believe that they have really fully internalized that concept. What we have now is not a strategy. What we have now is nothing more than a tactical response, largely to a political need, domestic political need than anything else, to be honest with you. If you look at what's going on right now in those parts of Iraq and Syria that are under ISIL's control, you're looking at a campaign, military campaign, in the form largely of airstrikes. There are some 60 members to this coalition, less than that, actively involved in bombing and airstrikes and all. But 6 months later, what has all of that accomplished? Even if you look at that component by itself, clearly that is one thing. There is need for adjustment. That by itself is not going to get the job done. There is no question that ISIL has to be confronted in a military sense. I mean, that should not be much in question. Question is how to do it. Is what's going on right now adequate? I think this is a question that must be answered quickly, must be addressed quickly before continuing to go along the same path. 6 months later, and all that has happened so far is for ISIL to be dislodged from merely 1% of the territory it has been holding on for some time right now. Little arithmetic would tell me that it will take about 50 years to dislodge them from the entire landmass that they are in control of. That definitely is not something that anyone would desire to see. Besides, if there is failure, then I suspect that actually military action of this kind would, if anything, reinforce and strengthen ISIL and ISIL-like organizations rather than weaken them. But that's only part of what has to happen. What has to happen to deal with issues of legitimacy, establishing systems of good government in the modern sense. And we should really emancipate from, ourselves from all of these, constraints about not wanting to have democracy of the kind that has worked for others and the rest of it. I mean, there is a lot of work that has to take place in the region itself, that our own leadership in the region has to address, our own civil society has to get busy with, and trying to find answers to those questions. If we would like to have systems of government that measure up to what is right, what's wrong by modern standards, while at the same time consistent with who we are as a people, background, heritage, culture, and all, it's we in the region who should really get busy doing these things and not wait for answers and solutions to these questions to come to us, come our way from Washington. But that really begins to define what we're talking about in terms of desperate need for a coherent strategy. The other component of this has to be devoted to dealing with those issues of opportunity, if I may call them that. Our region is characterized by the highest youth unemployment rate of all other regions of the world. I mean, this tells you something. Again, about lack of opportunity when it comes, and you're talking about people 16 to 30 years of age, and 30%, as a matter of fact, is an underestimate. This is out of those who are actually actively looking for jobs, not those who are discouraged, doesn't really take into account. So most likely it's an underestimate. Consider a situation where 30% of your youth are out of jobs. I mean, this causes wars, not only turmoil in countries themselves. So clearly this needs to be addressed. There has to really be massive intervention economically with a serious, thought-out strategy for injecting a lot of capital invested in infrastructure to really get the economies of those countries going, those countries in need going, while at the same time introducing changes and adjustments to systems of government in critically important areas like education, culture, and what have you. That really begins to define the kind of strategy we're talking about. But we're talking about long term here. And that's one reason why this discussion, I believe, is not in a way forcing itself on the scene, partly because it's very difficult for politicians, including in democracies, to think beyond 4 or 5 year terms or spans of time. But I think it's that kind of thinking that really should go into this. And that's why think tanks, as a matter of fact, communities of the kind we're really being hosted by today here in this event, play an important role to really, as a matter of fact, introduce this discussion and insist on actually following through with it. Because absent that, it's just going to be more in the nature of a tactical response, not a coherent strategy.
I mean, one of the problems in the last few years has been real divisions between American allies in the region. You've basically seen, in some ways, the Saudis, the new Egyptian government, basically acting as counter-revolutionaries in some ways to what's going on in the region. And then you have Turkey and Qatar sort of fueling it in some ways, which has made it very difficult for the U.S. to sort of create, I would say, some cohesive response with our allies in the region. Maybe starting with you, Ambassador Ricciardone, having been in Turkey, do you see the various U.S. allies in the region, whether it's the GCC, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, Jordan, coming together in some ways? I mean, even if the military strikes in Iraq and Syria, it's pretty, the Jordanians have really stepped it up in the last kind of week because of what happened to his pilots. As far as I can say, Qatar had never really engaged in any military activities. The UAE stopped and now is getting back involved. How do you see the cohesion between our allies?
I've been out of government now for 6 months, so I can speak from my experience up until then and then contacts with people in. Like any good crisis, if it's properly exploited by political leaders, it can deliver good results. It can strengthen the leadership and bring to a positive result. I certainly found that the Syria crisis, and then laterally, just before I left, the increasing obviousness of the ISIS threat, in fact, did serve in some ways to bring us together on an operational level. Things that don't get reflected so much in political speech and that are out there. In fact, there's a substantial amount of collaboration among the United States, Turkey, and interested Arab countries, whether in diplomacy, some of that was quite visible in the Friends of Syria that were sort of organized and brought together. At the law enforcement and intelligence levels, a lot finally did start getting done about the foreign fighter flow. We identified weaknesses in international cooperation, but also in national legal authorities in places like Turkey and elsewhere, but also Europe, in stopping the movement of bad actors, increasing the cooperation on funding flows. That sort of thing was happening. But if we had a more coherent view of what the problem is, and we would then have a better sense of how to go about it. So there's no denying that we have been working in some areas at some times on narrower purposes, if not to say cross purposes. If you're Turkey, you already have 2 million Syrians living in your country, some of whom are desperately poor, most of whom are traumatized one way or another. And that's if you're Turkey and you've got 78 million people or so to absorb them in. If you're Jordan or you're Lebanon or even Iraq that has Syrian refugees, you have even more serious problems. I don't think we've collectively, the Euro-Atlantic community, the people in the Middle East, really settled together on an understanding of what is going on there. As I say, you leave us to fall back as governments. We respond to today's headlines. We're democracies. We're driven by the news and what our people want today. I found in government, we were constantly putting out fires and responding to the exigencies of today. And you referred to the value of think tanks. One reason I'm in a think tank now is I wanted to deal with these problems. I saw no one better than the Atlantic Council to step back and not do a Sykes-Picot exercise where the smart people in Washington design the solution, but where we invite people like Salam Fayyad. We'll have leaders of the UAE here next week. We have a constant flow of visitors here. We reach out to them. And we try to have this conversation with people who are not all going to emigrate, who are investing their sons, their daughters, their wealth, who have a vision of what needs to be done. And we can precipitate that, I think. At least in the Atlantic Council, we mean to try.
Steve?
You know, one of the problems in dealing with this, and it's in the threads here, but this is a multi-layered crisis in a way that sort of few have been in my experience. If you look at it at one level, and part of the problem is of putting together a coalition to deal with it is that all the countries in the region see the layers differently, both the relative importance between them and how they react within them. So, level one, huge humanitarian crisis. it looks different if you're Jordan or Lebanon, with huge numbers of refugees, where the international community is not really doing anything nearly what they need to manage it, versus countries that don't have that problem. Then there is a terrorist problem on top of it. And there, of course, we have a struggle between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and different views about those. You have the kind of crisis in governance and legitimacy that Salam Fayyad talked about. You then have, in some sense, a geopolitical crisis and two cross-cutting efforts at empire. I'm sort of overstating it, but you'll get what I mean. There's ISIS and maybe Al-Qaeda that have a sort of Islamic-based notion of legitimacy and would like to obliterate borders in favor of this so-called caliphate. And then many people believe you have an Iranian challenge, which is seeking to project its power and influence through Iraq, through Lebanon, active now in Yemen, and talking about taking up the Palestinian cause. So if you look at all of those, it's a very complicated, multi-layered problem. And then overlaying that is the whole issue of political Islam, which is sort of the Muslim Brotherhood is the litmus. How do you feel about the Muslim Brotherhood? So the problem for the administration, and I think on this they've done pretty well, is how do you stitch together a coalition to deal with these multi-layer crises where individual countries feel differently about each layer. It's, there's really almost nothing like it in terms of the scope of the challenge that we have coming out of that region.
Can I get a bit more into this Sunni-Shia split in the region and how much more difficult it makes it to address this? Because the last 6 months, a year has been quite interesting in the sense that the U.S. is in negotiations with the Iranians. Our allies are mostly Sunni Arabs. But if you look at U.S. policies in the various countries, I know many Arab leaders basically think the U.S. is in some secret alliance now with the Iranians. We're in alliance with the Iranians in supporting the Iraqi regime. We're targeting ISIS in Syria, but explicitly not targeting the Assad regime in Syria. And we've stated that. We sort of set up some communications already with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, which is making the Saudis extremely paranoid. How much do you think this kind of Sunni-Shia split is feeding this conflict, and the U.S. policies kind of with the Iranians making it even more difficult?
I would have responded by saying this is really part of this thinking, but in terms of conspiracy theory, and there's no shortage of conspiracy theories in our part of the world. Unfortunately, some of what you said is true. So it doesn't fall in the category.
Right, I wasn't saying this is calculated. It's just happening by osmosis.
It doesn't fall in the category of things that did not happen, but people think happened. Whether it's engaging the Brotherhood, whether it's even having contacts with the Houthis in Yemen, whether all of the above happened. I happen to know. So it's not really part of this, again, about us being paranoid, thinking that the Americans are up to something here. Sectarianism actually adds another conduit through which you have this become even more intriguing, adds more to the intrigue. But this happens to be my own take on things. Take it for whatever it's worth. I said something about ISIL being a multifaceted phenomenon and organizations like it. And I insist with religion being the outermost layer of paint on top of something else, an ideology that is coated by religion, with religion being the outermost layer, not the innermost layer. The one right below that outermost layer is sectarianism. I'm not saying these problems don't exist today. As such, they merit consideration. But what I'm really submitting here is the genesis of the conflict is neither religion itself nor sectarianism. I do say they are there as problems today, and they have to be dealt with and addressed. But I think it's really important to put this thing in perspective. Shiite, Sunni divide, and actually the fact that the United States, well, we know right now, has been engaged, along with others, in serious negotiations with Iran, with many second-guessing, some actually concerned as to what that deal may be, and with some of the contours of possible package that may be agreed with Iran being subject matter of concern by parties who you would think otherwise are adversaries in some strange way. There's a serious question as to whether the discussion with Iran is sufficiently comprehensive, for example. The serious question as to, and this exposes one of the shortcomings of the current world order, what I really said before about lack of adjustment to new realities, the role of Russia in this. Could some of this have been preempted, for example, had Russia been dealt with differently? Could some of this have been preempted had there been some effort to agree rules of engagement, rules that govern international intervention, where a line is drawn between intervention that's legitimate and interventionism? Some rules can readily be agreed to. Somebody who engages in the killing off of his people, that's a country, that's a case that I think is meritorious of intervention. I do not know if you were to discuss these issues generically, for example, trying to come up with a code of conduct, so to speak. This is something that I believe serious leadership in advanced countries must preoccupy itself with at this stage. But to forget about that and just really say that we really are looking at a shared Sunni fault line, and that is really the cause of all these problems, it's a problem. It's something that needs to be dealt with. It has developed into a problem. It has to be dealt with, but it's not the genesis of the problem. I don't think, to be honest with you. The fact, I mean, Iraq did have an insurgency well before we heard about the grievances of the Sunni Muslims under the Maliki government, for example. There was an insurgency there before. There was an insurgency long before that, as a matter of fact, in other parts of the region, in Iraq itself, in other parts of the region. In Syria, by the Muslim Brotherhood, back during Hafiz Assad's days, as a matter of fact, in Hama. So region has been more like a dormant volcano, if you will. It's been dormant for a long period of time, maybe too long, to where when an eruption happened, people started looking for quick answers and quick explanations. Oh, it's a religion. It's something about Islam that's causing this. It's about sectarianism. But it really is about a lot more than that. It's about an angry, angry region that is full of feelings of injustice. And somehow this keeps piling up and piling up and piling up. All of this needs to change, as a matter of fact. The discourse has to change.
Steve, actually, I wanted to broaden this.
I was just pointing your colleague over there.
Okay, sure. One last question, I'll open it up. I mean, I'm curious whether you, Ambassador Ricciardone, think if there's an agreement with the Iranians next month, is this going to help stabilize the region or inflame it even worse, in the sense that we basically know a deal is not going to be it's not going to eradicate Iran's nuclear capability. You can already see that. The administration's arguing that we cut a deal with the Iranians. They're going to be more cooperative with us in Iraq, Syria, Yemen. That's what they're arguing. But I've heard from senior Arab officials that if we cut a deal with the Iranians along the terms that we're seeing it, the Saudis are going to immediately start building a nuclear program. And the Egyptians are going to go that way. And the Turks are going to go that way. So you could actually have more instability after some sort of agreement with the Iranians.
Please.
It depends on what else accompanies the agreement. The agreement, if we get one, is not going to be what any of us hoped for. It is not going to end the prospect of Iran having a nuclear weapon or having an option for a nuclear weapon. It's going to, in some sense, regulate its nuclear infrastructure and extend breakout time, for which if they did something, we'd have an opportunity to detect and react. It's not going to eliminate the enrichment capability, which all the UN Security Council resolutions called for to happen. So it's not going to be the agreement we hoped for. You can decide whether you think it is a potential opening for a a movement of positive movement on other issues, support for terrorism, intervention with its neighbors, and all the rest, I'm skeptical. I don't, maybe Rouhani would do it, but the Supreme Leader calls the tune. It will be destabilizing to our friends and allies. They will probably, in any event, hedge by trying to have their own nuclear programs. How destabilizing will depend on what else we do, whether we accompany that agreement with snapback sanctions and maybe pre-authorization of military force that makes it clear that if Iran does violate it, there will be consequences. Whether we accompany it with a more aggressive policy of confronting Iranian influence in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, whether we accompany it with a series of arrangements with states in the region that reassure them about our commitment to our security. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be surrounding it, and changes in policies which I would argue are useful in their own terms but would be essential to reassure our friends and allies in the region. If we don't do this and the administration just says, here's the deal, it's the best we can, toss it on the table and says to the Congress, we dare you to reject it, it's going to be very destabilizing in the region and in our politics.
Very quickly, I think if that were to happen, it would lead to, at best, I think, a situation whereby the United States is managing non-proliferation as opposed to actually doing something about it.
Right.
Because what you said, as a matter of fact, could happen in the aftermath of the deal that is not sufficiently comprehensive. But what I wanted to add, as a matter of fact, was this is an opportunity for the United States to take a regional approach to the region's problems. If you were to take, for example, the Iranian file as starting point of analysis, you mentioned some of the issues where Arabs and Iranians have problems. You mentioned Syria, Lebanon, my neck of the wood, Palestine, other places, Yemen, as a matter of fact. There are Iraq, some issues between some Gulf countries and Iran, for example, the islands that Iran has seized from and is controlling, and the Arabian Gulf, the UAE Islands, the Abu Dhabi Islands. There are many bilateral issues, as a matter of fact. None of them is in a positive state of play right now. But can the discussion with Iran take into account the totality of these considerations? And if you factor in the Arab-Israeli conflict and what exists already in terms of possibilities and modalities and instruments of possible intervention that are of a regional nature, like the Arab Peace Initiative, for example, is this not an opportunity to really put all of this on the table and see if you cannot really start a strategic dialogue going at the regional level that is inclusive of Iran, as opposed to this being just focused on Iran acquiring nuclear capability, weaponized nuclear capability, that is. I think this is a much better approach, one that really, as a matter of fact, can bring with it elements of stability from a longer-term point of view and begin to address some of the issues, including, for example, the one that had just erupted in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen in particular.
Great. Well, let's swing it open to questions. I see my friend Hythe back there. Why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much. I want to bring it back to the issue of governance. And the three of you mentioned governance as a key issue when it comes to state legitimacy and stability. And Dr. Fayyad, you said that much of the thinking has to be done in the region. My question to you is, what about the United States? Is there a role for the United States in engaging the issue of governance? What should the U.S. do? What can the U.S. do? Simply throw in technical assistance? Or is there something political? What should the U.S. not do? Maybe you can draw on some of your own experiences in doing this. Thank you.
I think, as you mentioned, a number of issues here, and all of which recommend themselves as possible instruments of intervention or promotion of good governance, if you will. technical assistance, but really most importantly, it all starts with the political will and what is seen as priority. You know, I don't want to really be unfair to those in office. Someone with the multiplicity of problems, like President of the United States, for example, they have to deal with on a daily basis, problems around the world and all of that sort of thing. I can understand why it is that more often than not, expediency wins the day. You're looking for a quick fix to a solution. It's not that you do not see the risk. It's not that you are not strategic enough. It's just that you see bloodshed, you see a crisis, you want it diffused as quickly as possible. And this historically has led, as a matter of fact, over decades, unfortunately, to unwittingly. I'm not saying there is a conspiracy here of sorts. I'm not really saying there is an intent to see a region evolve into a situation where it's governed by strong men with people living in poor states and weak states and all of that sort of thing. But that's what happened. I think for starters, I think there has to really be a strategic decision made to really be on the right side of the people. If you really ask me about where the United States is, where it should be, conceptually, as a doctrine, a decision has to be made that they need to be. That's a key question that someone in office really need to, an administration, Congress. Where are the people? People are on the right side of history when it comes to their own rights, in terms of them expecting their governments to govern them in a respectful way, to be able to live with dignity in their own countries, for their needs to be responded to be governed by responsible and responsive governments, to where they feel they are sovereign in their own country, that they're to be served by their governments, not to be servants for their governments, to wake up every day thinking, you know, their highest good is to sing the praises of the regime and all of that. This is the culture. This is what people in the region are rebelling against. And this is what the United States has to really begin to address in a fundamental way by sending the right signals. There's not really a great deal that needs to be done beyond that to begin with. Issues of technical assistance, financial assistance, you know, having your program of assistance conditioned or governed by the need for it to be promoting of these ideas, of this kind of view, worldview of what governments should be about in the region. I think it's hugely important in a direct sense, but also indirectly through the very important role which the United States plays multilaterally in IFIs, IMF, World Bank, and also within the broader community of nations, in the context of cross-Atlantic relationship with Europe and the rest of it. I mean, the United States is a primary mover. I mean, it's not, so sending the right signals, acting along those lines in the context of the fora I mentioned, you know, beginning to send a signal, a message that all of this is important. I think this would reinforce where people are, and this would begin to put people in the right frame of mind insofar as their perception of where the United States is and what it is that inspires its policy, what its policy is about and should be about.
Anyone else want to hit that one? Ambassador? I think it's over there.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the Atlantic Council for leading and talk about such an important issues. If I draw, like if I'm a movie producer and if I want to move forward with this and see what are the prequel, current status and sequel of this, I will see sequel as a coexistence. That's the best we can come out of, where others don't want to annihilate each other. And if I go to the prequel, then I will have to look into the soul searching and a bit of reflection, whether it's United States, whether it's might or others as well. The region, if we talk about the Middle East, has serious problems internally. It has to go through a soul searching in relation to aligning its religion, to culture, to the governance issues, and so on. And United States, in its support, it can, I wouldn't say it can manage, but it can provide a grand environment for the dialogue, a serious dialogue to take place internally and with the other powers. Without that, I think if the United States sees this as this can sort of set the scenery, and lead it forward, I think it will find problems because it needs to re-justify its legitimacy into the region and so on. So I think that's where it has to be a serious soul searching within the United States and others. Sometimes saying sorry to an event will be more effective in our region than others, than enticing it with governance issues. I think so. I think it's important that this opportunity is taken advantage of, and not looking for short-term solutions. Otherwise, the conspiracy and others as well, it becomes a serious issue. In Iraq, for example, it has to provide an environment of getting rid of ISIS, not as an objective, but as a mean for providing an environment for a dialogue for Iraqis to play with the regional players. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The gentleman in the blue turtleneck.
I'm Harlan Ullman with the Atlantic Council. First, I'd like to thank the panel for a really incisive and comprehensive examination of the issues we face. They are serious. I want to put my question in an unfair analogy of history to make my point. Roughly 6 or 7 months after Pearl Harbor, we had a good strategy. We put together a coalition, and because of the battles at Midway, Alamein, and of course Stalingrad, we had turned the war around. 6 or 7 months after Barack Obama announced what he called a strategy of degrading and destroying, which is now defeating, and appointed General John Allen as the senior envoy, we don't have a strategy of any kind of amount. We haven't come up with a chain of command, who is in charge in the White House, or who is in charge in the coalition. We have 62 countries organized in a coalition, 20 in a sub-coalition. As Ambassador Ricciardone talks about, yes, we have got working level groups that are exchanging information, intelligence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But why has it been so difficult, when I say us, the coalition, to name some people in charge, set up responsibilities, and set up, if not statements of work, what it is we wish to achieve, and replicate what we did in a similar amount of time during World War II?
Did you direct that question at anyone? Who wants to take it?
Well, I'm not part of the administration, particularly, and there are some things I think they could have done better. But I think the analogy is not apt. I think one of the things I hope the panel showed today is, conflicts, even world wars among nation states, are clearer and in some sense easier to come up with strategies and implementation plans than the kind of multi-layered political, social, economic legitimacy kind of crisis we see in the Middle East. I think that's part of the problem. It's just much harder, at least at this stage, the challenge we face in the Middle East. And so I have some sympathy for the extent to which the administration is struggling with this. And whoever comes in January 2017, it's going to be a big part of their agenda. They're going to be struggling with it too.
I actually agree. You yourself said it's an unfair analogy anyway. But at the heart of this really lies this important distinction. You're dealing with a non-state actor, although ISIS calls itself a state. It's more of a self-proclaimed state than anything else. No one else recognizes it as such. It's a non-state actor. And as the experience with ISIS itself amply demonstrates, and the experience with other, Al-Qaeda itself actually demonstrated before, and other actors of the kind amply demonstrate, it's very, very difficult to win a war against them in a decisive way. All it takes is for some to survive bombings, and they would declare victory because they're still there. You launch a war, prosecute a war against a country, you devastate their infrastructure, you win. The clear signs of military victory. The kind of world we live in, you don't have that. And as a matter of fact, more and more conflicts around the world are taking this form of insurgencies. But I think it's really important. We all are saying that there's something about this that requires more work in the direction of putting together a strategy, and one that is not concerned only with appointing someone in command or in charge or something like this, but to fundamentally define the task. As was defined by President Obama back on September 10th of last year, he said to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS, destroy. Degrade to what extent? And that is why I think we really need to begin to look at the content of the military component of this effort so far. And that's the sense in which I meant if it continues to be of the kind that has been taking place for the past 6 months, it is not out of the question that this kind of intervention could actually, if anything, reinforce ISIL's hand and make it somehow stronger and better able to recruit even more people, more fighters for those who perish, and to replace them and all of that sort of thing. Is it going to be adequate? And I think this is a really key question to ask. Is it really going to be adequate to harm in a serious way their command and control? This, I think, is very important, because what you have here, when you're looking at ISIS itself, its evolution from 1999 onward, as a matter of fact, going through various stages to declaring statehood back in 2006 onward, and then last year was, of course, turning point, caliphate, and the rest of it. It's an insurgency turned state, self-professed state, yes, self-proclaimed. But then you go after them militarily. Then you risk another transformation back into insurgency. If you look at Afghanistan, for example, there was a lot of effort, massive campaign, and it did harm Al-Qaeda's command and control to the point where it was not able to carry out acts of terrorism to the extent it would have been able to, but for the extent to which its command and control were damaged by the campaign then. Is what's going on in Iraq and Syria today of that order of magnitude? I question that, to be honest with you. Just learning of the footage of that gruesome killing of the Jordanian pilot, Maad Kasasbe, news of which was all over, with good reason, as a matter of fact. Well, I understand this is a video of about 22 minutes. I imagine that it must have been shot several times. This is massive production, I'm told. Open space, not something that is suggestive of a group, daylight, that feels under, being chased after by anyone. You know what I'm saying? So this is one sense in which I question, the extent to which what is going on is adequate to degrade command and control by ISIS as it transforms ultimately back into insurgency mode. It's not that it has abandoned that. It's still doing that. There are explosions in Baghdad and elsewhere that take place in Iraq on an ongoing basis, and ISIS is part of that. ISIS is part of what's going on in Sinai as well, along those lines, as well as in eastern Libya. So it's not that it's not insurgents anymore. But if you go after it militarily, and if you strengthen that level of activity substantially, you drive them back into insurgency mode. If their command and control is not completely degraded, then you're looking at a serious risk of this becoming most dangerous phenomenon internationally, not only regionally. This is, I think, the context in which the effort overall has to be evaluated. The extent to which this is a well and adequately conceived tactical response or not. Even at that level, I think it really needs to be examined. In my humble opinion, it needs to be looked at that way, but it needs to be reinforced by a serious strategy aimed at dealing with the root causes of this problem, that is ISIL and groups like it.
More questions? Back there. I can't. There you go. Thanks. And address who you want to.
Dave Ottaway at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I want to get to the nitty-gritty of good governance and when we know and we see it, and the relationship of democracy to good governments, because democracy, as we've been promoting it in the Middle East, has created an incredible amount of, it's exasperated, all kinds of rifts inside society, sectarian, religious, tribal, regional, et cetera, et cetera. And when it has worked in Egypt, we have not supported it when we didn't like the people who won, the Muslim Brotherhood, and we didn't, and when Hamas won. And the one country where there's been a relatively happy outcome, which is Tunisia, it has not led to any dealing with the economic problems of the country. So where is democracy, is that the signature of good governance? And how do you get to the problem of solving the job problem?
Frank, why don't you start as an old Egyptian hand?
It's hard to speak of Morsi's victory there and then followed by his year in office as a successful experiment in democracy. It seems to me that they blew it, that whatever the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to prove about their commitment to democracy proved the opposite. They didn't seem like Democrats. To me, observing, I was in Turkey at that time, I wasn't in Egypt. I can't think of a single democratic, small d democratic move that he made. He did not embrace, he and his party did not embrace inclusive politics by any stretch of the imagination, and ultimately they failed. So I wouldn't have referred to that, the whole, as a success for democracy. Perhaps the election he was given a chance to govern better than he wound up doing, he and his party wound up doing. And again, it goes back to the question of legitimacy of the state versus legitimacy and democratic acceptance of the administration of the state. They did not govern wisely. They were removed by extra legal means, extra constitutional means. It didn't look to me like a triumph of democracy by any means there. Perhaps, Salam, you could speak to the question of Hamas and democracy. I remember in the administration I was in Egypt, and we looked at that election of, was it May 2006, April 2006? And we were all debating what that meant.
I think one of the adjustments that need to be made as we look to the future where there is more acceptance, let's say, of government, is accepting outcomes of elections. I mean, there should be no question about that as a guiding, organizing principle. And if we're talking about the United States and its foreign policy posture, it should be a key tenet of that. I just said a few minutes ago that the United States should align itself with the people and as a guiding principle. And there is no better illustration of that than the United States being readily accepting of the outcomes of elections if they are fair and inclusive. But elections and democracy is about more than one man, one vote, one time. And I think it's important. It's not the job of the United States to dislodge someone from power, actually, if they do not govern right. And I think, but this is a question for the United States itself to sort out. And in fairness to the record, I mean, I don't believe the United States administration was eager to jump on the Sisi bandwagon early on. To the contrary, as a matter of fact, my own sense is that there are still traces of ill feelings about the manner in which the administration dealt with the emergence of Sisi, which came in response to popular uprising against the Morsi regime at the time. But in principle, I agree. I mean, I think elections outcomes need to be accepted. Going back to what I believe is needed as a task, and I recommend that there be an effort to really look at trying to come up with a code of conduct, so to speak, that is universally shared. Look, the United Nations was set up a long time ago, and a lot of the rules that govern international diplomacy need to be revisited. There have been enormous changes in world structures, including the rise of non-state actors and all. None of this was envisaged or foreseen. The entire Charter of the United States is written in terms of states and state behavior. It's not written about non-state actors and all of that. All of this really needs to be reconsidered. But as part of that effort, I think, again, I go back to the notion of what constitutes legitimate grounds for intervention. elections outcomes should be respected. This is key. But there ought to be, I think it's fair enough if we're really looking to the United States for leadership and for guidance and for help and support, both directly and working with others. I think it's really important, as a matter of fact, for us to commit ourselves to the holding of free and fair and inclusive elections with regularity, for example. So it's one thing to be respectful of elections outcomes as a norm, and I think this is a really good norm to respect. But at the same time, there ought to be the expectation that elections and democracy are not about one man, one vote, one time. And if that doesn't happen, then somebody somewhere in the world order needs to be in a position of saying, hey, you know, I've gone too long without doing this, or the process is flawed in this and that, and the other way. Another issue is democracy is not only about elections. Between elections, it's about public space. How much of it is really public, and how much of it is purview of the existing state or ruler. The state of affairs right now in the region is by and large dominated by by the fact that rulers basically control the public space. They apportion out of it however much they deem fit to whomever they deem deserves to be apportioned to. And those who are not fortunate enough to be on the receiving end of this largesse fall in one of two categories. Either aspirants to really get some of that space which they have been denied, in which case they have to really do all kinds of things to appeal to the largesse of the ruler to get some of it, or fearful of expressing themselves to the point where they know if they were to act in protest or in dissent on all, they're going to be punished forever, and that public space is something they're going to be denied forever. When you really begin to factor in considerations of this kind, that I think is when the agenda is broad enough for a meaningful discussion of democracy and its role in the political development of the region. And I think it's really important. This notion about public space is absolutely important. It does not necessarily exist with elections, particularly when elections do not take place with regularity.
Great. I think we have like 1 minute, so maybe we can get one more question. Right there. Short one.
So really quick, Tyler Vandergrift, Shia Rights Watch. So what are your thoughts on allowing Iran to cooperate with us militarily now, and then in the nation-building process after?
Who is this addressed to? Who did you want?
Just to the whole panel.
Maybe we can start with Ambassador and.
I guess I understand. Allowing Iran to cooperate with us. What?
I think he means like coordinating directly our military Iraq with the Iranians.
It seemed to me when states have common purposes and identify them and are able to work together on them, so much the better. But I guess I'm trying to get at the deeper intent of your question.
I think the problem of doing explicitly with Iran is that the risk is you alienate the Sunni members of your coalition at the state level, and you alienate the Sunnis within, for example, Iraq, who are essential if ISIS is going to be tossed out of Anbar province. So that's the problem, and I think the way they've resolved it is there's sort of conscious parallel action without official coordination.
He poses an either-or kind of thing, and the United States is quite capable of dealing with competing friends, allies, adversaries, and all the shades of gray in between. That's
Great.
my experience.
Well, we're right at 5:30, so I thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you.
It was great. Steve, Ambassador. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.